folks. Thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare this morning, and awesome week and month behind us now. July was just full of racing all around the world. Awesome to see this weekend some pro racing at the US Nationals, and just the difference between athletes that are focusing on, of course, the 100K distance at the PTO, ones that are clearly in big blocks leading up to the Worlds at both Nice and Hawaii this year, spreading out the ladies race in Kona and also the men's race in Nice. Today, we want to spend a little time sharing some of what we're seeing both ourselves at SFuels with folks using CGM, continuous glucose monitors, and some of the findings that they're having, which is surprising in many respects, where we see athletes and even everyday consumers beginning to use these tools to understand more about what's going on inside their body and their response to the world around them, and obviously what they're consuming. And I do want to then just have an update, which is really a response to a question about granola. And we have done shows in the past, but it's such a common food for athletes, not just in the mornings, but through the day as a snack. And I did want to share a little bit about what we've done in the Keto3 product and contrast that to granolas on the market and why we think it makes a difference. So let me share some slides here, and we'll get right into it here. And that should be coming up now. Okay, so yeah, as I said, we'll spend a bit of time on just some of the learnings ourselves with athletes, and then also what we're seeing on experiences around the web as continuous glucose monitors are applied. And then we'll get into this topic on breakfast granolas and beyond breakfast also. So let's jump into this. I think, let me firstly say, CGM is obviously an evolving technology itself. There's a few things to be aware of about it. When we do a blood prick on the finger or what have you with a classic blood glucose glucometer, we're obviously reading the blood directly there. CGM is actually measuring the interstitial fluid. And because of that, there is sometimes a little bit of a delay between what's showing up in the blood and then what is showing up in the interstitial fluid. But generally fairly accurate. There are nuances, but generally fairly accurate. But what is, of course, so interesting about these continuous glucose monitors is just that it's continuous measuring of extended periods of time, what's going on in terms of glucose levels, and rather than just an instance in time. Now, regardless, though, of which form that you're using, obviously CGMs are not cheap. They're quite expensive if we're using them for extended periods of time. Of course, in the case of diabetic sufferers, they need to use this for really an ongoing period. But really the objective with using these tools is ultimately about seeking to transition to a more stable blood glucose measurement, and whether that's in rest or during exercise and training. And it does, frankly, surprise us. It's almost like a stunt where we've seen on the internet, even professional athletes publishing their blood glucose CGM data and how it's spiking up and crashing down multiple times through the day, and almost being suggestive that it's a cool thing. Well, it's not cool at all. Obviously, when it's high, there is, if that is happening for extended chronic periods of time, that's a real health issue, and we'll touch on some of that. Secondly, obviously, if it's crashing down, obviously energy levels and focus, ability to have cognitive focus, and obviously ability to have physical strength and endurance is diluted, is blunted. And neither of those scenarios are a good thing. And obviously at SFuels, we talk a lot about when you do have these spikes in blood glucose, obviously there is a resultant insulin response, and that response, of course, can blunt and fat oxidation, which is something that we are aiming towards improving the efficiency of, that we can rely more on fat than just the glucose form of substrate. I'm using 3 sources today. One of them will be an article that you can find out on the Outside website, and we'll make sure we put some links, not just here in the video, but also we'll put the link in the YouTube text, so you can cut and paste or just launch straight from those links. And then there's a Apple podcast, which was an interesting one, probably more just a general consumer. The Outside example is, actually using it in exercise training sessions and trying to understand what happens with different pre and during consumption of carbohydrate, and what happens to the blood glucose readings. And then finally, we'll use a YouTuber who's an Ironman athlete in training, Lachlan Earnshaw, just age group athlete, and just some of his experience, if you will, of using CGMs, and just really some of the shocking data that comes out of this, where athletes can be quite unaware of what's going on, only to find that they've really got some quite significant issues that need to be addressed. And we'll jump into some of that data, because it is really quite surprising. So as I said, the first one I want to really talk to is just this, classic consumer, if you will, not really, if you will, an athlete in training for racing as such, but this is coming from a podcast called Strength in Hormones, and you can check it out online on the Apple podcasts. But just using it day to day through a period of a month or so, what were some of the interesting findings, and maybe findings that weren't expected in terms of different types of foods and just environmental environments that created either rises in blood glucose, or things that maybe you assumed would trigger heightened blood glucose and really didn't. The first was really just a question that the podcaster rose around consumption of high salt drinks that typically are sweetened with some type of non-nutritive sweetener. So think of that as your sugar alcohols, and in some cases stevia. And what was found was then both these high salt drinks and also the prebiotic drinks, even though it didn't have next to basically no carbohydrate, it was still triggering a blood glucose response that was actually not that different than a full meal. And that was surprising, obviously. Now, the podcast had talked a little bit about, these sugar alcohols, which there are some studies that are suggestive of some of these also having, even though they do not have a caloric load, they some of them still seem to be triggering a blood glucose response. Now, the podcaster then talked a little bit about stevia. Now, most of the research I've read really doesn't point to a lot of consistent data suggesting that there is a problem there with stevia. Certainly not monk fruit triggering, and demonstrably showing that it can trigger a blood glucose response. So I think these examples of these, high salt drinks and prebiotic drinks having a trigger here, probably a little bit more research needs to be put onto that. But it was an interesting response. Chewing gum was also another one that had, quite a reaction. And I think that's interesting. And again, of course, chewing gums can come in, with a caloric load just by having sucrose or fructose inside of it. And then some of them also have, these same sugar alcohols that could be causing the problem. Podcaster went on to talk a little bit about extended periods of ambient heat, high heat. Now, this was a little different. She called out if just having a shower in the morning did not seem to have much of a response, if any. But, extended environments of heat, and the reference made was just, working and living out of the home without air conditioning, could see this, heightened level of blood glucose. And I think this just gets back to really just the nature of the classic physiology, whereby, pretty much any stress that triggers, whether it's adrenaline or epinephrine or norepinephrine, these hormones, as a response to stress, those hormones absolutely will heighten blood glucose levels. And of course, in the stress environment where the muscles are not really moving, that blood glucose can then obviously trigger an insulin response. And we know that can obviously blunten fat oxidation. But the key point there is, pretty much any form of stress, and I'll get into the outside, article in a second, as the second case on the web, and it talks about other examples of life stress that are also, triggering blood glucose being raised. Now, exercise, we know obviously that exercise raises blood sugars, but the podcast had talked a lot about having an illness for a little bit of time and was getting back into exercise, and saw that, there was a much more stronger response to this exercise in terms of rapid spiking of blood glucose, particularly around lifting and high intensity interval training. And again, we'll see that in the outside article next. And for herself, zone 2 had less of a response. That's not always the case, and we'll talk to that in the cases coming up. But, a key point with this, of course, with exercise, it's different that, you're sitting on a couch and you either have like life stress, or you take in some very high carbohydrate loaded foodstuffs. And obviously all of those examples will raise blood sugars, and it will cause an insulin response because the muscles are not open to that blood glucose in terms of the transporters being able to support the blood glucose coming out of the circulation into the muscle cells. Insulin will help do that. Now, in the case of exercise, of course, when the muscles are contracting and releasing things like nitric oxide, things like free radicals, calcium ions, the mechanical contraction itself, it's mostly thought that those things are responsible, that within, a period of time, depending upon the intensity of the exercise, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, those channels will open up without insulin, and therefore allow the blood glucose to come out of the blood and into the muscle cells. So, it's different with exercise. It's a healthy contrast of raising that blood glucose levels, and for the muscle cells to be without insulin, bringing that blood glucose into the muscle in terms of supporting the energy requirements of the muscle. And yeah, like I said, for her, there were certain things which her initial thoughts were that there would have been some type of heightening of blood glucose. Things like, adding cream to the coffee in this morning, just assume that there would be some type of response. Having some type of carbohydrate at night, but it was mixed with, fat from the meat, or putting fat over the meal, or oils, I should say. And there really was no real response. And this is important to understand as we think about, whether it's in the morning breakfast or lunchtime, etc. Look, we are really extreme training athletes, and with that, absolutely, you will burn carbohydrate and fat. And the SFuels guidance is not about no carbohydrate; it's about the right fuel at the right time. And we do encourage the use of carbohydrate. But with that, by adding some fat with that, whether it's the morning breakfast granola, we're going to talk about that, or whether it's a salad with, meats and what have you, putting fat and oils on top of that, all of these things is going to really smooth and blunten the blood glucose response. And that's important to understand in our daily meals and planning for those meals is to add the fat back in to really have that blunting effect. So let's talk about the second article, which is from the Outside magazine. You can find this online. Again, we'll put the link down on that. And this was really a number of examples, mostly on using CGM during different types of training sessions, from zone 2 to interval training, both running and biking. But there was also an interesting, as I was saying earlier, there was an interesting case that was called out in this article of just the nature of life stress. And the example that was given for this, the writer, the author of this article, was just, presenting, having a presentation at work, and just seeing that the stress of that, the impact that it had on a quite significant heightening of blood glucose levels. And, you can see this, of course, in HRV data and the response to that, but it was interesting that even the blood glucose response would be quite material and significant from life stress. Now, I would add to this, you can see this happen a lot with stress that then, of course, has a negative implication on quality sleep patterns. And you'll see that, again, if you will, prolonged adrenaline or prolonged epinephrine from life stress can obviously have a detrimental effect to sleep. And, both of those things, poor sleep, heightened, prolonged stress response hormones can also have this more chronic elevated levels of blood glucose. And, I think what's to think about for athletes with that is, as we go into races, and just being conscious that the stress of the race could also have this, heightened blood glucose level response in our blood. And, I think you do really want to plan for and think about, as you're going into races, what are you doing to just kind of, manage the stress of the race? How are you taking time out during the day as you get into the, the week of race week? What are you doing to just kind of dilute the stress levels of it all? And of course, there's plenty online to what you can do, whether that's from meditation to yoga to some light exercise itself to social time with friends, but just trying to dilute and get your mind off the race so that you're not really, bringing up the stress hormones, having a negative impact on your sleep, and then, of course, raising blood glucose levels. But the two examples in this article that I did want to kind of just call out, one was around, or both of them were actually zone 2 exercise workouts. One was a 42-mile ride, so 60 kilometers thereabouts. And 2 hours into that ride, they took a bar and a gel. I don't need to give the brands. You can find it out online. It doesn't really matter. But these are classic, formats in terms of, fairly high carbohydrate loaded bars and gels. And even at that point, the fact that it was taken as, the gel and the bar together and the whole lot together, there was an 100-point spike in blood glucose and then a subsequent 100-point crash in blood glucose. And, this would be sufficient to have some detrimental effects on fat oxidation. And certainly as that crash down to that, I think in this case, it was like 70 millimoles per liter levels, you would feel that in terms of energy levels post, that crash. So I think as we think about, just because it's zone 2 and it's like not high intensity, if you're going to, have some form of carbohydrate, particularly in the latter end of the session, and not 42-mile, 60 kilometers, you hardly need it. You basically should be training without carbohydrate on a session like that. But if it's a 3-4 hour session, absolutely from 2 hours onwards, you may want to be thinking about some carbohydrate. But the way to use it is not this massive load in dumps every, 30 or 60 minutes. You should be thinking about sipping it, if you will, or small doses of it over a period of time that you're going to help, again, just to smooth that blood glucose levels and avoid that spike and crash that can happen if you take it all at once. The second example is a 23-mile run, so really quite a solid run, getting close to a full marathon there. And 30 minutes prior to this run, the author took a peanut butter and honey on bread and did purposely. By the way, in both of these examples, the author's well experienced a runner and athlete, and knew exactly that both of these things would be causing havoc to blood glucose level, but did so purposely to kind of bring out what would happen. And look, every case is different, but I think when you look at just these extreme examples, it really just puts an edge on how the body does respond. And in this particular case, the example here was this construct of taking some type of carbohydrate before a long zone 2 session. And of course, this was the training, 30-40 years of training on, if you will, some type of pre-carb loading being a good thing. And again, remember, this is a zone 2 session. So we know with zone 2, the metabolism naturally would be to mostly burn fat. And yet before a session like that, the guidance has been, and that the industry has suggested, that you should, hit yourself with some type of carbohydrate before the session. Well, it wasn't really just that was a 40, 50 point spike. It's not really a problem, but a 60-point drop straight after that, absolutely, you can have this, more hypoglycemic response. In this case, referring to a rebound hypoglycemia, and that is insulin that's doing that. And Dan Plews has showed in his own labs and had published papers on this, of this pre-carb loading, and as a function of that, the insulin heightening, and as a function of that, a very clear and measurable blunting of fat oxidation that comes with that. And these long zone 2 aerobic sessions are really trying to train that metabolism of aerobic efficiency, which includes efficiency of oxidizing fat for fuel at that intensity. So this is why for some time at SFuels, we've guided not to preload with carbohydrates, certainly for zone 2, and even coming into a race. It was interesting that this author of this article at Outside sought the guidance of the medical doctor of the EF Education pro cycling team to actually look at the data that was coming off his CGM. And this particular point about preloading, the medical doctor of the EF Education pro cycling team also made comment on, look, in the Tour de France, a number of the stages, of course, start out pretty slow. And in those cases, there's no need to, have a whole bunch of carbohydrate prior to the session. Of course, there's some rides or races or stages, if you will, where it immediately goes into a mountain stage or a elevation rise. And, very quickly, the body will begin to draw down by either liver or muscle glycogen, releasing that glucose for energy. So the requirement to, preload is really just not there. Rather, actually get started, let the body itself, the liver, the muscles, begin to release some glucose if it's needed, as it's needed. But certainly for these zone 2 sessions, it's just simply not required. Okay, so now I want to just take a look at this third example, which is actually a athlete that recently came to SFuels, and prior to engaging with us, had been classic high carbohydrate athlete. He's in training for Ironman. You can check him out up on YouTube there. I've got the link there. But he came to have access to a Dexcom CGM monitor, and really started using that back in the May-June period. and really wanted to understand, with what he's doing, just what was going on from a blood glucose perspective. And in many respects, it was just an interest, as opposed to he thought that there was a concern or a problem. And, if you look on the left here, this was, really June data. And you can see in the chart below, this is a 24-hour period example back in June, where most of that range is in the 6 to up to 10 range. Now, of course, this is millimoles per liter of blood glucose, and for most people, of course, it will obviously fluctuate with respect to meals and what have you, other drivers like we talked about on the earlier two cases, stress and what have you. But the key point here is that it's mostly above those ranges. And in fact, while a lot of it's suggested that it's in range, really this is a, what you would, for all intensive purposes, refer to as a pre-diabetic case. And he couldn't believe the data that was coming off the CGM, and he went and got a glucometer and tested similar data to make sure that there wasn't an error. And sure enough, it was saying the same thing. So he went to his doctor. Medical doctor basically couldn't believe that he should worry about any of this in light of the training he was doing, which is, 15, 20-hour week. In fact, if you go to his YouTube channel, you see that there's times where he's doing up to 27 hours a week. He just posted a 6 hours Zwift ride, his findings with that. So, fairly solid athlete, and really, for all, as I say, intensive purposes, you would think that with all of that, there shouldn't be any problem with, insulin resistance and glucose responsiveness and coming back down after meals and what have you. But he did really have quite a high carbohydrate, both diet and obviously the nutrition he was using during his training sessions. Just as a point of reference, generally we would say that from a fasting blood glucose perspective, it should be in the, sub 5.6 millimole per liter range. And as you can see there on the left, he was, quite consistently on average above that. On the right, and this is again really only 4 to 6 weeks later, and he's still, I would say, optimizing around, choosing relative to the intensity from rest right through to high intensity interval sessions, and zone 2 in the middle of all of that training. He's still learning how to match up, if you will, foods and nutrition during the day, if you will, outside of training, and also the nutrition he's using inside of training. So we started working with him, and he was using the SFuels products. And even in that short amount of time, 4 to 6 weeks, you can see that average glucose level coming down. I think it's on the right here saying 99% of his blood glucose level is now in range. So, this can be corrected by really applying right nutrition inside and outside of training, and really bringing that to a healthy level. And like I said, it's not like he's having to dilute or change his training program at all. Like I referenced, if you check out his YouTube channel, you'll find there is one of his latest posts is on the 6 hours Zwift ride. So I don't think there's any harm or diluting or changing the training program, but more about improving your blood glucose metrics. Okay. What are the big takeaways out of this? Well, look, firstly, high blood glucose, it's either coming from something that's triggering the muscles or the liver to release it into the blood supply, or we are taking a lot of high carbohydrate intake in through the diet. Both of those things will blunten fat oxidation. And we just need to be conscious of, if we're trying to improve the efficiency of that, what are the things that are triggering that muscle liver release, of blood glucose. Of course, if it's exercise, it's not a problem because the exercise and contracting muscles are going to take that back up into the muscle without insulin. But of course, if it's high carb or like the next bullet point, just new stress. By new stress, what I mean by that is the body interpretation of either life itself, meaning the stress of life, or the example we gave of extended ambient heat, or when the stress of life raises our stress hormones, whereby sleep is affected. These things will raise blood glucose levels. So it doesn't just have to be diet and high carbohydrate diet consumption. So we need to watch for life stress and manage that life stress accordingly, and think about, ambient environments, not just the heat, but the ambience of stress that can also be elevated our blood glucose level. Now, to help from a dietetic perspective, we are going to have some carbohydrate, quality, complex carbohydrates in the foods, by adding healthy fat, healthy oils, olive oil, etc., onto, is going to soften that blood glucose response, and that's a good thing. I would just take as a takeaway for all of us as we think about our zone 2 sessions, which is probably 80% of our training. You can still spike and crash blood glucose by taking, dense, high carbohydrate loads in those sessions. Try to avoid it. Firstly, if it's anything under 2 hours, you really don't need to at all. If you're trying to improve the efficiency, stick with a low to no hydration and fueling source like SFuels TRAIN. If you're doing those extended ones, the 3, 4, 5, 6 hour sessions, if you're going to add some carbohydrate, you should really amortize it over that latter several hours of the training session and really have small amounts over time rather than these big blocks all at once. And as I said, exercise with a high carbohydrate lifestyle is, still, it is not creating an immunity from some of these chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes. So we absolutely need to think about both diet and the nutrition we're using in our training, plus exercise, that we would, reduce the risk of some of these chronic conditions. So let's jump across now to the start of our day. And we had this question come up recently on granola and, how to best prepare it. And, is there good and bad version of granola? Well, of course there is. There's good and bad of most foods, just the way how they're prepared. But it's such a staple, cereal. I'll just say cereal, whether it's a muesli or a granola or a rolled oats type thing. They're such staples for athletes. And it's just that we use these terms very loosely, like something like granola or muesli. But of course, it can mean very different things nutritionally depending upon the makeup. And to give you an example of that, this is just the nutrition fact panel I've taken from the top 3 sellers for granolas on Amazon. So I'm kind of doing an ad here for them. However, I will just call out when you dig into these, what the makeup is. You can see on the case on the left, the number 1 seller, 48 grams of carbohydrate, and that's of a total, serving size of 64 grams. And even though, that's oats, cane sugar, these types of sugars, they rapidly digested in the gut to glucose coming into the bloodstream. Again, if you want to test it with a blood glucose glucometer, or better still, a CGM, go right ahead. You're going to see how rapidly these things come into the blood. The middle example, 38 grams out of 65. And then on the right-hand side, again, you got to watch out for this. Sometimes we do these comparisons in the aisles at the supermarket, and you put 2 products together and you just look at the amounts. This says 20 grams, but you got to remember it's actually, though, only against a serve of 30 grams. So in effect, this has really got 40 grams of carbohydrate if you were to compare apples for apples between these three particular top 3 sellers on Amazon. So these are pretty high carbohydrate doses, and that's all assuming that you're just gonna the consumer just sticks to 2/3 of a cup. It wouldn't be uncommon for an athlete to be having more than that. Now you'll see with these, they're also coupled with really not a whole lot of fiber, particularly the middle and the right-hand side. So this carbohydrate is going to move fairly rapidly through the gut. They also have very low fat amounts. So these are going to move fairly fast into the bloodstream. And you're going to have what we've just been talking about, these heightened blood sugar responses very rapidly. Now, we absolutely want, the good thing about granola is just it's such a easy meal to have. We absolutely want a dense caloric meal as an athlete to start our day or after our first session to really, power us through the day and support the training blocks that we engage into. So let's take a look at what we did with Keto3. You'll see that the carbohydrate load, it's only 10 grams out of 40. So it's probably around 15 grams in total if you were to compare to, say, the 60-gram examples of the products before. But of that 15 grams, more than half of that is fiber. And you'll see that the total fat amount is dramatically higher, 19 grams. And what's important to point out here is that, we still want a very rich caloric load, but it's coming through fat so that it's not triggering the blood glucose level up so much, and it's certainly still giving you the calories we want in a dense breakfast. We want the fiber and we want the protein and the fat to really slow down then any response to the blood glucose responses. Now I'll put a link up in YouTube and I'll put it up in the top of this video here, where we did a video comparing the different types of Keto3, how does either as a muesli or as like a rolled oat type format, or like you're seeing in this image here as a granola, and we show the blood glucose responses of that and how flat it is. And you can take a look at that video to see it. So the reason this format or this macro profile exists is because of what's being used in Keto3. It uses a number of nuts and psyllium fiber, and then obviously quality whey protein isolate to create that macro profile. And that's why it will have such a smooth, very low blood sugar glucose response, but still give you the calories you need to power your training. This is how you do the granola. Straight out of the packet, it's more like a muesli with, milk or berries or what have you. But if you do want to create the granola, you're basically adding some coconut oil and you're mixing that up. You're putting it in the oven. You bring it out of the oven, let it cool, put it in the fridge, which will then harden up. And then you can break it up into more, granola type chunks. If you want it to be, stick together even harder, stronger chunks, if you will, granola chunks, mix some egg into that, and it will fuse together really easily. You can see the link here for this recipe. It's also up on the website, but hopefully that, gives you a little sense into how to create a granola that doesn't shoot your blood sugars through the ceiling, but keeps it flat, but powers your training sessions that you've got lined up ahead of you for the racing that's also in plan. Thanks very much for joining our Monday Mindshare. I hope you found that interesting on CGMs and granolas. I hope you have an awesome week. And like always, I wish you all the best and go longer. Thanks again for joining.